Hello everyone, so this week we will finish up chapter 7, which is painting, and then get into chapter 8, printmaking. So printmaking is probably the most process heavy form of art there is. So we can really geek out on technical terms and different techniques and history and things like that. But I'm just gonna try to be concise about it, because there's just, I mean, if you go down that road, it's going to be a few weeks of just talking about different techniques and terminologies and things like that. So yeah, let's get started right away. This is week 11 already, which means that we only have 5 weeks left. That is very scary. Alright, so this chapter we're gonna finish up talking about the painting. So we're gonna learn how to distinguish between pastel, watercolor, gouache, and other similar media, which will be the aqueous medias, meaning that it's water soluble. And we're gonna learn how to explain the benefits introduced with the invention of modern acrylic paints. We talked about how acrylic paints is so easy to use, and it is why, and for that reason why it is my favorite type of paint. And we're gonna learn how to note how artists have exploited paint and painting beyond traditional practices. So let's dive in. So aqueous. So last chapter we learned how paints were made, different types of paints, and non-aqueous paints such as encaustic, fresco, and oil paint. So in this chapter we will focus on aqueous paints such as watercolor, gouache, and other similar aqueous media. First, we're going to talk about the pastel. So in the last chapter, which was I believe was drawing, we learned that classifying materials is not always easy, it's not always black and white. So we looked at how pastel is a medium that exists somewhere between drawing and painting. So that is why we are talking about it again in the section of chapter of painting, which we already talked about it in chapter of drawing. So it is a very dry medium. However, because of its weak binding nature to the support to the paper, artists can use stiff brush to move around the pigment with or without water. So I think in the demonstration video, I used like a paper towel or a tissue to just move around to create a mark. So because pastel doesn't really have that binding binder into it, it can be freely moved around just by rubbing on it. And also if you add water, you can kind of mimic that kind of a wash to look of watercolor as well. So in this example that we looked before, Edgar Degas used this technique to blend the colors of the dancer's skin, and he added water to draw a surface to create this watery wash for a light tint of color. Another example is done by Georgia O'Keeffe, and she used pastel for this painting called White Shell with Red. So this work shows the intense color that can be produced by pastel, and just notice how vibrant and intense that red is. So she initially drew the painting with pastel and then smoothed the drawing strokes with a brush and her fingers so that the colors blended seamlessly, resulting in this aesthetically very pleasing and beautiful gradation of color. So Georgia O'Keeffe is a very important figure when it comes to painting. Also the painting that we know of, American painting and all this contemporary painting, all that stuff. So let's take a look at, I hope this video is not too long. So let's take a look at this video, 5 minutes. We might have to cut it short. Let's take a look at it.
A canvas drenched in sunset hues, colors radiating like flame. At first glance, this painting may appear to be an impossible abstract image, but a closer look reveals the tender stems, lush petals, and velvety texture of a canna lily. This metamorphosis of natural subjects into abstract geometry is commonplace in the work of Georgia O'Keeffe, the revolutionary American painter and sculptor. But the magic behind this transformation remains just as elusive as the artist herself. Born in Wisconsin in 1887, O'Keeffe spent her childhood plucking wildflowers and arranging fruits to paint. At 17, she moved to Chicago to study at the prestigious Art Institute. Her teachers trained her to faithfully reproduce reality in the conventions of European masters. Although she enjoyed the solitude and precision of this work, O'Keeffe felt little personal connection to it. After moving to New York, she was increasingly drawn to the clean lines, striking composition, and vivid colors of Japanese art. O'Keeffe soon found a teacher whose lessons inspired her to put those interests into practice. Unlike her previous teachers, Arthur Wesley Dow urged his students to focus on more abstract representations of light, shape, and color. These lessons manifested in O'Keeffe's first series of abstract drawings. Rendered in charcoal, they present a series of undulating lines, bold shading, and billowing clouds. These drawings defy easy classification, suggesting, but never quite matching, any specific natural reference. Earlier European painters in the Cubist tradition had employed rigid geometry to abstract external subjects. But here, O'Keeffe employed the shapes and rhythms of nature to capture her internal feelings. Experiments like these would soon become a cornerstone of an artistic movement called American Modernism. Although no single style defines modernist painting, its proponents shared a desire to challenge the realist traditions that dominated art education. Beginning in the late 1910s, modernist painting often used geometric shapes and bold colors to probe the American psyche. O'Keeffe threw herself into these experiments, but she was reluctant to share her new work. However, when a friend sent her charcoals to the art dealer Alfred Stieglitz, he became entranced. In 1916, he arranged for a grand exhibition in New York. This marked the beginning of O'Keeffe's career as a popular artist, and a relationship that would lead to marriage in 1924. Marriage didn't diminish O'Keeffe's taste for solitude. She traveled widely to teach and often retreated to paint for months at a time. Whether she was exploring the craggy canyons of Texas, the quiet forests of South Carolina, or the sun-bleached desert of New Mexico, her creative process was based on ritual and close observation. She paid meticulous attention to small details and spent hours mixing paints to create exactly the right colors. When she found the perfect hue, she'd record it in her ever-growing collection of handmade color cards. O'Keeffe also experimented with perspective to celebrate objects that were often overlooked. In Ram's Head with Hollyhock, she places a weathered skull and a delicate flower high above the hills below. This massive skull overshadows the landscape, casting both the skeleton and the mountains in a new, eerie light. The public was captivated by her unique perspective and secretive behavior. She was particularly praised for her massive flower paintings, ranging from fiery poppies to ghostly calla lilies. Stieglitz and other critics of the time were infatuated by Freudian psychology and were quick to link these paintings to female genitalia. But O'Keeffe dismissed such interpretations. She resented the male gaze that dominated the art world and demanded her work be respected for its emotional evocation of the natural world. Eventually, O'Keeffe settled down in New Mexico near one of her favorite artist retreats. In her 70s, her eyesight began to fail, but she continued to mine the landscape's mysteries in new, tactile mediums. O'Keeffe kept creating until her death at 98 and is remembered as the mother of American modernism. Decades on, her work retains its wild energy, and O'Keeffe, her personal mystique. Get to know the life of another legendary
Alright, so that's Georgia O'Keeffe.
artist, Frida Kahlo.
Alright, so let's get back to the talking about paints now. So now, let's talk about watercolor. So watercolor consists of pigment in a vehicle of water, which were the name, I guess, from, and gum arabic, which is the binder, a sticky plant substance that acts as the binder for watercolor. So as with drawing, the most common support for watercolor is paper. I think we talked about it on my demonstration video. And also, like drawing, watercolor is commonly thought as an more of a intimate art, smaller in scale. And whereas the oil paint usually has to do with like a grandeur, like the couple of the paintings that we looked before, like the Raft of the Medusa, is giant paintings, but watercolors tend to be smaller and in much more intimate size. And also, it was commonly thought of as free in execution, but and it was overshadowed by the prestige of oil paints for several centuries. So watercolor was often used to create smaller scale and intimate painting, often in this kind of a rushed painterly style manner. So the nature of watercolor paint gives them accessibility since it only requires a glass of water to paint, and they could readily be taken on sketching expedition outdoors, and they were a favorite medium for amateur artists because of this ease of the accessibility. So the most apparent characteristic of watercolor is their transparency. So they are lightly applied thinly in translucent washes. So in watercolor, the white of the paper serves for white, and dark areas are built up through several layers of transparent washes. Excuse me. So in my last demonstration video, we looked at how to build a really intense color. You have to apply a lot of layers to achieve that intense color. Even if you do that, it still is not fully opaque because you start to see the paper through it. And so if you take a look at this example right here, in this Winslow Homer's painting, Key West Hauling Anchor, it is a perfect example of what we might think of implementing a classic watercolor technique. So the strokes seem controlled yet spontaneous in feeling, and it gives the impression that the paint is still wet. And also the way he implemented the paint onto the support, which is the color, is considered as a traditional. This is how it's supposed to watercolor look like. So that would be a great example for that. So another aqueous medium that is commonly known is gouache. So gouache is another aqueous paint, but unlike watercolor, it has the characteristic of opaqueness to their color properties. So they're not translucent like a watercolor. So this is achieved through adding inert white pigment, which becomes colorless in paint. So it serves to make the color opaque, which means when used at full strength, they can completely paint over an already painted surface, even if it is darker than the paint you are applying to, which is not the case with the watercolor. I think I put enough emphasis on how if you paint someplace darker, you cannot paint over with the lighter color, otherwise. Because the nature of the translucency of the watercolor, but gouache, it is possible because of that white inert to the pigment. So the most common gouache paint is that one of those poster paint that is given to children. That is because the ease of use, so it's water soluble, so you only need a cup of water to paint it, and also the safety. So oil paints and other acrylic paints tends to be toxic, especially oil paint, because it is oil based, and that's why if you paint a house, you have to ventilate it for several days before you can live in there, because the oil paint is generally toxic. So that is why the gouache paint like something similar to gouache paint is given to the children, because it's easy to use and B is safe. So gouache, just like watercolor, it can be applied in translucent wash if you dilute it with water, but that is not the common use for this type of paint, because if you want that, you might as well just use the watercolor. So gouache dries fast, and due to its fast drying nature and this resulting in this intense and uniform manner, it is great for a large flat saturated surface of color, as you can see in this here. So you see the intensity of the colors and everything. So in this example, the Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam used both translucent and the opaque possibilities of the paint to create this beautiful painting of the Cuban jungle. Right, so now let's talk about this revolutionary paint, acrylic. So I think I already talked about this multiple times. The acrylic is very easy to use and is relatively safer than the oil paint. It tends to be less toxic, and it's just so much easier to clean up because it's water soluble when it's wet. So acrylic is relatively very new medium. So with the advancement of technology and chemistry during the early 20th century, by 1930s, chemists had learned to make strong, waterproof and industrial paint, and also cheap as well, using a vehicle of synthetic plastic resins. So by 1950s, the chemists were able to produce paints that adopted artists' requirement for performance, and the popularity of acrylic paint just exploded from there on. So the vehicle of this paint is not quite aqueous. So the vehicle is polymer, which is just a fancy word and broader term for plastic. So plastic is also polymer. So this special vehicle is water soluble when the molecules are not fully linked. But when they do, it creates a tough and flexible and waterproof film. So the biggest strength of these paints are their versatility. So depending on how it is used, how it is applied to the support, it can mimic almost all the paints that we look so far, even like paintings like tempera paintings. And also, it can be layered into a heavy impasto like oils, or diluted to mimic watercolors. This watercolor's iconic washed look. And it is also fast drying, but the drying can be delayed when it's mixed with other chemical to kind of mimic that process of oil painting, and then try to achieve that preciseness that oil paint allows because of its slow drying process. So it is very versatile. And last but not least, but another great advantage of this medium is that it can be used almost any type of support. So it has very strong binding capability. So it can be used on paper, prepared canvases, walls, and etc. So far, most of the paintings we look are easel paintings, meaning that a painting was created on an easel or similar support. As you can see in this Velasquez painting right here, he has this kind of a giant easel and the support, and he is painting on this canvas. So easel looks like this. So an easel is a portable stand that props up a painting in progress vertically, so that the artist can work facing it in the position that a viewer will eventually take, because paintings mostly it goes on the wall. So easel painting became very popular during the Renaissance, and it dominated the Western painting tradition ever since. So all the famous paintings you can think of, Mona Lisa, The Starry Night by Van Gogh, most of them are easel paintings. And easel is a very useful and powerful equipment for creating artwork. However, because it's such a useful tool, it can also be very limiting as well. So by using easel, you're limiting the point of view, and the perspective and location of where you're painting, and the size of the canvas, and also orientation, and which, because of all that, it also restricts the movement that you can have while you're painting. So with that being said, modern artists started to seek new means of expression and have pushed the boundaries of easel painting by incorporating different ways of creating painting. So this is the guy we looked before. So for example, in 1940s, Jackson Pollock abandoned the easel and spread his canvas on the floor so that he could spatter and drip paint onto it from above, instead of having it vertically and then trying to create a composition. So we looked at how Jackson Pollock created his painting through what he called action painting, where he moves around and paint with such an intense action. I mean, relatively intense action. Of course, he has to have this cigarette. That's kind of an iconic look of him. And notice how much more intense that is compared to just easel painting. So he used to call this act of his painting action painting. So continuing this idea of abandonment of easel, during 1960s, Linda Benglis took this idea a step further and poured her color directly onto the floor and just let it dry there as is. So working with large cans of latex paint, which is similar to acrylic paint, she poured overlapping flow of vivid color onto the floor, creating works she called fallen paintings. So she's a very interesting figure, so let's take a look at her work.
My name is Linda Benglis, and the name is Contraband. I did it in 1969. These are ultraviolet colors. The trade name was Dayglow, and I ordered 500 pounds of each of the colors and had them in my small studio, and would go into larger studios and actually pigment large vats of rubber latex, and I would pour the painting on waxed linoleum and sometimes directly on the floor. The scale was dictated by the places that I actually did the work. I was thinking particularly where painting could go from a kind of defined area that Greenberg had set forth. However, I've never been a gestural artist in terms of an expressionist. I think my interest in materials is very contextual and has not so much to do with the expression, but it has really to do with my learning what the materials are and what they can do in relationship to art history and contextually in relationship to the environment, the room, the wall, the floor. The work itself has a certain kind of demand. It's moving. It's usually bespeaks of nature. I think women are very involved with the ebb and flow of life and materials. It has something to do with mixing and cooking sometimes chemically. I'm very involved with the way things taste, and I think art is involved with surfaces and chemicals and mixtures and questions about matter and material. I still think of myself as a painter for some reason. I think I'm painting with liquids, but making objects that are dimensional, that have a sense of their own space, but demand some viewing in terms of walking around. But to me, it was always a situation of making your own material in order to work.
So if the this latex, if it dries, it just turns into just giant of rubber. So this is just big slab of latex for now.
Liquids.
All right, so now let's talk about prints and printmaking. So in this chapter, we will learn to describe relief printmaking process and their characteristics, distinguishing intaglio printmaking process and their advantages, lithography, and screen printing. So let's talk about printmaking. So printmaking is relatively unfamiliar form of art to most of people, but they do not know that they see it every day and literally everywhere. So if you have ever accidentally tracked mud into the house in your sneakers, then you understand the basic principle of making a print. So a pigment or substance, in this case mud, is transferred from its original place to a support, which is in this case a floor, and thus making a mark and printing a mark. So if you repeat the same action, you will be able to produce multiple identical marks just by stepping back to the mud and then making a mark onto the floor. So this, making identical multiples, is the unique characteristic of printmaking. So you can create identical multiples relatively easily, unlike other form of art such as painting and sculpture, where you're gonna have to paint it meticulously and try to mimic it exactly, but it's never going to be same because it's free-handed, painted or sculpted. So the process of printmaking varies, and it is very different from painting. And printmaking it's gotta be one of the most process-heavy form of art. And you have to learn. There's a lot of terminology and different techniques, and you really have to see all this to understand how it works. Me just explaining in words is not going to work. So for that reason, you're going to be watching a lot of video in this lecture. And yeah, so those but these are videos tend to be a little technical, but it's very it's well made, so I think you guys will enjoy this. So let's take a look at this short film talking about how printmaking works. I think this is kind of a really long video, so it's 13 minutes, so let's see.
The exhibition The Printed Line brings together prints from the Arts Council collection and together represents a wide range of approaches to printmaking. This short film introduces some of the main printmaking techniques and looks at how each process makes different demands on the artist and allows for a different use of tools and drawing materials. The matrix, that's the surface from which the artist makes the print, which may be wood, lino, copper, etc. Each has its own characteristics, and the artist must work with each in order to realize their personal vision. Relief printing refers to any kind of printmaking process where the ink is placed on the surface and the image is printed directly from the surface. Woodcut is one of the most direct forms of printing and one of the earliest, and uses the long grain of the wood as the matrix. In this print by Matisse, all the white areas have been cut away to leave the raised areas which print as a black. In this linoleum print by Barry Flanagan, the cut line reads as a white drawing on a coloured background. Linoleum is very much softer than wood, so it offers less resistance to cutting and allows for a much more fluid line. Wood engraving, on the other hand, uses the end grain of the wood as the matrix onto which the artist cuts their design, using very sharp tools such as a burin. End grain is a very tight and smooth surface which allows for very, very fine detail and a sharp, clear line, as can be seen in these images by Eric Ravilius and Gertrude Hermes. It was also ideal for printing in conjunction with type and became very popular as a means of book illustration. Intaglio is a generic term for all those printmaking techniques which require the line to be incised into the surface of the matrix. Intaglio techniques include both non-chemical processes such as engraving and dry point, and also chemical processes such as etching and aquatint. Similar tools for wood engraving can be used for engraving into metal, as in this copper engraving by David Jones. The metal engraving is printed through an etching press using damp paper onto which the print is transferred. Dry point is probably the simplest of all printmaking techniques. The artist literally just has a tempered needle which they then draw onto the surface of the metal plate. The harder they press, the deeper the line. This wonderful Picasso print shows how graceful the dry point line can be. In total contrast, the Frank Horbach prints have been made with not a kind of conventional printmaking tool, but an old nail that is literally scratched and scored into the surface, giving this print a kind of earthiness, a kind of physicality that really is very reminiscent of the surfaces of his paintings. Etching was a great step forward in the development of printmaking, since instead of the artist having to apply pressure to make a line, the artist could now draw fluently into the metal plate, which had been covered with an acid-resistant wax ground. The drawing would then be given its characteristic by immersing it in acid and allowing the acid to bite the line in the metal. The longer the plate is immersed in the acid, the deeper the bite, and therefore the darker the line. Great skill is required to control the acid and to give the desired effect, as can be seen in this elegant print by Anthony Gross, where the variety of lines have been achieved by biting the lines for very different lengths of time. And in the delicacy of this Lucian Freud etching, where he's clearly been very sensitive to the manner in which the acid would bite the line. In order to build up areas of tone, the artist could use cross-hatching, as in this print by Norman Stevens, or in Cracked Pipes by Keith Coventry, which pays homage to the master of cross-hatching, the Italian metaphysical artist Giorgio Morandi. Aquatint was a later development in intaglio and enabled the artist to actually work with tone without having to resort to cross-hatching. A very fine layer of rosin dust is sprinkled over the surface of the plate, which is then heated and fused onto the metal, and the acid can then bite in between each particle, creating a texture that is more like sandpaper, and that in turn will hold ink. In this print by David Hockney, made in 1966, you can see the way that aquatint has been used in conjunction with conventional etching. The bed covers have been rendered with aquatint and finely bitten, so that there's a degree of transparency and the etched line can be read through the aquatint. There are many variations and combinations of technique within intaglio. Photographic images can be printed by coating the metal plate with a light-sensitive layer and exposing a negative film to ultraviolet. Once exposed, the plate is immersed in acid and etched in the same way as in conventional etching. In this image, one of my own prints, the image was developed on the computer and extensively reworked before outputting as film to make the final photo etching. Lithography is a process by which grease and water repel one another. So the artist makes their drawing in any materials that are very greasy onto either a lithographic stone or onto a zinc lithographic plate. One of the great advantages of lithography for artists was that they could use the same kind of tools as they were using in the studio, pen and ink, brushes and crayons, instead of actually having to use tools like burins, needles and things like that that could inhibit a more spontaneous approach to printmaking. This print by Oskar Kokoschka really exemplifies the way that lithography can be used as a drawing medium. You can see that the artist has drawn with litho crayon. It's very, very direct. It has all the spontaneity and fluidity of a drawing, except it has this wonderful quality that it could be printed as a multiple and therefore reach a much wider audience. Working in colour in lithography is quite a complex process because lithographic ink tends to be quite transparent. So the artist really needs to be able to understand how one colour will act when it's placed on top of another. In this beautiful print by Ferdinand Léger, the French Cubist artist, you can see how each colour has had to be drawn separately on the plate and then printed on top of the previous image. It requires very, very accurate registration and quite a lot of pre-planning in order to execute an image as refined as this. Screen printing is a commercial process by which an image is made by blocking out a fine screen mesh with a stencil or gum. Where the screen is left open, ink can be pushed through the screen using a squeegee and printed directly onto the paper underneath. As with lithography, each colour requires a separate stencil and precision is required in registering each colour accurately. Generally, the printing would be made on a vacuum bed, which holds the paper in place and allows for very fine registering so that the multicolour printing can be carried out accurately. Edoardo Palozzi was one of the artists that really took full advantage of the possibilities and potential of screen printing. This is a very, very complex print when you imagine that each colour has had to be printed separately with its own screen. So incredibly accurate registration was required, and it also incorporates both flat colour and imagery that has been photographically sourced. A very complex collage approach to image making. Patrick Corfield, on the other hand, really explored the fact that silkscreen was perfect for printing flat, pure colour. You can see how beautifully he's actually been able to realise an image of great simplicity but with great intensity and without any sense of a human touch.
Alrighty, so there was the introduction to 4 major category of printmaking. Alright, so let's go over some of the terms that was introduced in that video, and let's geek out on some technical things on printmaking. So like I said, printmaking is probably one of the most process-intense art form, meaning that there is a lot of science and different techniques involved in making an artwork. So for instance, painting is relatively more straightforward. You just get a support, which is canvas, and a paint, a brush, and just, start painting on it, and then you get an artwork. But, printmaking, you have to have different kind of a drawing surface, which is matrix in this case, and each different matrix you can have different kind of a look and different kind of a possibilities and capability that you get. So So in this lecture, we are going to watch a lot of video on different techniques, since I think it is almost impossible to explain all these processes in words, and it'll be much better for you to actually see how it works. I mean, at least through the screen, and how different techniques of printmaking works. So first term that we're going to look at is matrix. So matrix is a physical surface that can be manipulated to hold ink, which is then transferred to paper. So common material for matrix are wood, copper, stone, which linoleum and rubber, etc. So different type of matrix are what gives each printmaking process a name, such as woodcut, which is using of wood, lithography. Do you guys remember the monolith, and how in Latin a lith meaning rock, so which matrix would be the limestone, and etching, so for instance copper etching and things like that. Next important equipment that comes with the printmaking is press. So when I was in grad school, I used to have a lot of friends who was in the printmaking. I used to call them press nerds, because they think of press as very special and precious equipment. So press is used once the matrix is finished and inked. Oftentimes printmakers use a press to transfer the ink from matrix to a support. So press is a mechanical device for applying pressure, but not just pressure, but even uniform pressure to an inked surface resting upon a print medium, which should be print support to canvas or paper and cloth and things like that. And there are many different types of press out there, but one of the most common one is this type of a roller press. So where this kind of this giant metal, stainless metal, is located right there, and then you adjust the pressure, this roller, and then you adjust the pressure with these knobs, and then once you get the desired pressure, you use this lever to you spin this, and then this entire bed will go through this roller, and this roller is going to apply that even pressure to the matrix and then the drawing medium, resulting in perfectly printed image. Or anything that can apply uniform pressure can be used as a press. So in this case, a steam roller, commonly used for road construction, is evening out the road, can be used to print this kind of a larger scale MDF woodcut printing. And oftentimes they print it on this kind of canvas or fabric to create like a larger scale printmaking. So if you go to like an art school which has like a printmaking program, they hold an event for steamroller event where they rent out a steamroller, and then they invite the communities to bring a large a matrix to print on. So if you ever go to that kind of if you ever get a chance, participate. One is always really fun to watch, and they make it a big deal out of it. So it's always interesting to see that. Alright, so I will have to wrap that lecture because it's been 45 minutes already. So we're gonna take a look at the four major type of printmaking lecture. So for this week, I will be posting the study guide around Wednesday or Thursday, maybe Friday, but I think it'll be Thursday, at least Thursday at the latest. So it'll be around 60 to 70 questions, going over the chapters that is going to be included in the exam. And most of the questions are going to come from the exam questions are going to come from the study guide. So I really suggest that you find all the answers to the study guide. If you are stuck, you can't really find any answer, just send me an email and I'll point you right direction on where you can find the answer, and then just have it right next to you when you take an exam. I mean, I'm not even I mean, it's online, it's an open book exam, open note exam, so having that study guide will really help you to do good job on this exam. So last time the class average was a little too low, so I had to give you guys 20 points extra credit, but this time it is only going to be 10, so I strongly suggest that you study up. And yeah, so that exam is going to be open from 19th to 23rd, so you'll have a week to work on, but that doesn't mean that but I would strongly suggest that take it at Thursday night at the latest, just in case something goes wrong. Last exam I received a lot of emails saying like broken computer, unstable internet, and all that stuff, you know. So to avoid all that, I would get started as soon as possible. So if you have any questions, just send me an email and just be on the lookout for that study guide. I'll send an announcement if the study guide is uploaded. So yeah, I'll see you guys on the next video.